Well, thank you for that kind introduction and to the organisers for the opportunity to be here, which I very much appreciate. I'm an economist, and like most economists, we tend to be fairly fond of markets. We like markets, and there's a long tradition of that goes back to Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand, and some of the most celebrated formal theorems in economics, the so-called welfare theorems, are about conditions under which markets lead to an efficient allocation of resources. But it was sometime well after Smith's original notion of the invisible hand that somebody asked a very important but seemingly basic question, and that was a 21-year-old undergraduate at the London School of Economics, Ronald Coase, who for his third-year summer paper at the London School of Economics, asked a great question, which is, well, if markets are so good at allocating resources, if they're such an efficient way of allocating resources, why do we have these things called firms? We have a lot of things called firms. They're pretty prevalent. Why would that be? And he went on to provide an explanation for that based on what he called transactions costs. And developing that question and answering that question in more depth has occupied parts of the profession for many years and still does. And what I'm going to try and talk about today is based on two academic papers of mine that try to think about how this question of what happens in firms and what happens in markets, what economic activity happens in those two different spheres, may change and in fact already be changing with the development and the evolution of new technologies in the digital era. So the first one is really around blockchain and the boundary of the firm, and it's based on a paper with my friend and former colleague Anup Malani at the University of Chicago. And the key theme here is that blockchain technology in particular provides a new technology that may alter the boundary of the firm, and it may do so by allowing more sophisticated contracts to be able to be written, and that if contracts can deal with certain contingencies better than they might have been able to in the past, that could move some economic activity outside of taking place in firms and lead them to take place in markets. And the second is based on a paper with Robert Akerlof and Luis Rayo, and that is about firms in markets with network externalities. And what we do there is develop a framework for thinking about or modelling competition between firms in markets with network externalities, markets where the more that other people consume of a particular good or service, the more attractive it is for me to consume that good or service. So platforms of all kinds are a canonical example of these kinds of markets. We have a way of thinking about competition between firms in those markets. And the key theme that runs through our analysis there is that there's a fundamental asymmetry between firms that are what we might call or dominant firms. They have a very large market share and presence, and firms that are out, smaller firms trying to aspire to that in status. And the asymmetry is in the following sense, which is it's very hard to go from being an out firm to being an in firm. You could ask Microsoft and their Bing search engine, which I'll talk a little bit about later as an example of how challenging it can be to go from being out to being in. But on the other hand, it's actually relatively fragile being an in firm. It's quite easy, in fact, dangerously easy to go from being in to being out, as say Netscape would be an example of. So those are two things that I'm going to talk about. So in thinking about firms versus markets, to a first approximation, half of all economic activity takes place in markets and is mediated by contract or trust, and half of all economic activity takes place in firms. And the modern economic theory of the firm is really due to Oliver Hart and co-authors of his, and Oliver shared the Nobel Prize with Bengt Holmström in 2016 for his contribution on the modern theory of the firm. And property rights theory, as it's known, really posits the idea that asset ownership is a very important and powerful economic thing, and that if I own assets, then I don't need to bargain with anybody else about how to use them if we disagree about how to use those things. So a kind of old economy example of this is if one thinks about an electricity generating plant that's going to use coal to generate electricity. And if I think about establishing an electricity generating plant, I want to put it pretty close to some kind of coal mine because it's costly to ship coal, so I'd like to minimise shipping costs by being really close to a coal mine, and there are probably quite a lot of coal mines that I could choose from. But once I build my plant, I go from being in a situation where it's a pretty competitive market for buying coal to one where it's not at all a competitive market because I've located next to this coal mine, so they have an advantage over me. Now that advantage, which is known as the hold-up problem, wouldn't be an issue if we could write a contract that contemplated and took care of all possible contingencies that would come up. But to do that would require a lot of forethought and knowledge, and it would also require a third party like a court or an arbitrator to be able to interpret the meaning of the contracting parties correctly. So we'd have to be able to describe quality. We'd have to be able to describe exactly what type of coal was going to be delivered to me. We'd have to describe when it was going to be delivered. We'd have to describe exactly how it was going to be delivered and under what conditions it was going to be delivered. We'd have to describe what would happen if there was some unforeseeable event like a natural disaster and what we would do in those circumstances and so on. And part of the sort of baseline observation of property rights theory is that's going to be very hard to do. And we're typically going to be in a world where contracts are somewhat incomplete. And I could solve this hold-up problem as, say, the electricity generating plant by just owning the coal mine. Then I don't have to negotiate anymore. I just tell the employees of the coal mine who work for me what to do. And if there's a disagreement, I just tell them what I want them to do and problem solve. Now, there's an inefficiency that comes with that as well, and balancing these costs and benefits is really what, in this theory, determines what happens in firms and what happens in markets. And then the interesting question at this point is to ask, well, how could new contracting technology, of which blockchain is one but not the only example, how could this affect that? Well, as I said, the sort of animating observation of property rights theory is if things were contractable, then we wouldn't have a problem. If we're in a complete contracting world, then there wouldn't be an issue. And economists have developed clever game forms or ways of structuring interactions between parties, sometimes called mechanisms, or in the language of economics, this is a field called mechanism design, have constructed these game forms where they say, well, even if we can't write a complete contract that a third party, like a court or an arbitrator, could mediate, we could provide the contracting parties themselves with appropriate financial incentives to actually tell the truth about what they originally intended. Now, these are sort of esoteric in some way, these mechanisms, and we don't often see them in the real world, or at least we haven't. And there's a debate about why that may or may not be. The question here is, can new contracting technologies like blockchain actually help the parties do better on this account and in some sense take advantage of these clever mechanisms or some version of them that game theorists and mechanism designers have come up with. And the two basic issues with these mechanisms, as I see them, and as I think most people do, is they require a fairly strong degree of commitment. So they require the parties to say, we're going to specify some financial punishments that are going to occur if this or that behaviour occurs, and we're going to want to stick to them, even if at the point when they occurred, we would say to each other, let's renegotiate. This doesn't make sense for one of us to pay a huge fine off to a third party. We should just renegotiate that and not kind of shrink the economic pie. But of course, anticipating that possibility, they won't have the desired effect of deterring behaviour in the first place. So that's one consideration. And the second consideration is sometimes these contracts that require large liquidated or stipulated damages just won't be enforced by courts. And it's possible that blockchain technology may be able to help address both of those points. So one of the key points, of course, as people in this room will know far better than I do, is that the distributed nature of this technology can provide a form of anonymity. So it can be very hard for somebody to go to a court and say, I need this provision enforced. It can happen automatically. And I'm thinking here of smart contracts written on platforms such as Ethereum, but there are others, of course. And if these smart contracts can be written to be essentially self-executing based on events that can be known to the computer code or the script, then these can just happen, and it's going to be hard for a court to intervene or for people to renegotiate because of this self-executing nature in this anonymous way. So, for instance, a court would find it very hard to reverse some damages payment that's just been automatically made from one party's account to another party's account. It's gone, it's done, and who do you go after? A string of account numbers that are hard to verify. So the very distributed nature of this kind of technology, perhaps in some sense paradoxically, may actually expand the possibilities of what can be contracted on. And because it's hard to overturn these transactions, one would require famously more than half the computing power on the network to do it. It's very hard to reverse these things. This irreversibility is a way of providing commitment and the ability to commit. And that could be helpful, as these clever mechanisms and the people that have come up with them have kind of pointed to as a matter of economic theory. We may be at the point now where this could be a matter of economic practice. So what's the implication of that? The implication of that is, in one sense, quite straightforward, which is if you make contracts work better, it's a bit like making contracts more complete, and that would suggest that we should see more economic activity, by no means all or even a lot, but some more economic activity move outside of firms mediated by asset ownership and into markets mediated by contract. And the extent to which that will happen and is already happening, I think is a very interesting and important question. So it doesn't mean that asset ownership isn't powerful and important, but it might mean that there's more economic activity that could take place in markets. And one of the questions that itself leads to is there a way to facilitate and make that better? So as I said, these smart contracts on certain platforms like Ethereum are already allowing this to happen. Those are, if you like, a little bespoke, those solutions. And so I think there's a good practical question about whether these kinds of at least sort of basic contracts, smart contracts, can be mediated in a better way. And if so, that's going to create economic value by reducing these hold-up problems and reducing these frictions, and that could create a meaningful amount of economic value by doing that. So this, of course, can go beyond. Blockchain's not the only technology that's changing potentially the boundaries of the firm. So tokenization is another thing that's very important. We've seen a huge phenomenon with the rise of initial coin offerings. One way of thinking about that is it's as a financing vehicle and as a potential alternative to, say, venture capital. Another way of thinking about it is it's another different contracting technology that's going to allow all manner of things. And I think other speakers later today and tomorrow are going to talk about the implications of that for things like providing incentives and various other things. And of course, the sort of general question about solving matching and trust problems is something that goes well beyond blockchain technology. We're already seeing that for many years now on platforms to do with ride sharing or deliveries of various kinds, or even dating and so on. So it's a broader question about the role that new contracting technologies can have on what happens in markets versus firms. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about, and this is switching gears a little bit, but it's on the same general topic, is about firms in markets with network externalities. The 5 largest publicly traded companies in the United States that I've listed there all arguably work in these kinds of markets any platform company. Facebook's one example, to use a US example, Amazon's another one, and various others, of course, around the world operate in these kinds of markets. And I'd say there are three key features of these markets. The first is that winning firms tend to win big. They tend to serve a very large share of the market. The second is this asymmetry that I mentioned at the start of my remarks, which is it's hard to go from being out, or small, to being in, but being in is no guarantee of continuing to be in. It's sometimes a fragile position to be in. And that leads to the third observation, which is these winners, these in firms, realising this fragility, are typically not asleep. They're constantly updating their search algorithm. They're constantly revising their ride-sharing platform. They're constantly trying to innovate. They're constantly making acquisitions. And I listed there just some of the numbers of acquisitions that some of these large American firms have made over recent years. Very large numbers of acquisitions and often very large dollar amounts involved. So the challenge with thinking about, as an economist, how to model these markets is that these kinds of markets give rise to what we call multiple equilibria. So you could imagine a platform that's very popular. Think of a ride-sharing platform, for instance, where there's lots of drivers on it, which makes it attractive to me as a rider to be on because the car's going to come very quickly for me. That's self-reinforcing. That makes it attractive to drivers to want to be on it. So there's a good equilibrium where kind of everyone's on this platform, and it's very good. It's also possible that there's, if you like, a less appealing equilibrium where there are not many drivers, so there's not many riders, and that self-reinforces that there doesn't make a lot of sense to be a driver. And so both of those equilibria can arise, and it leads to this question of how one thinks from a formal modelling perspective about how to distinguish between these different equilibria. And that's, in a sense, the main contribution, I think, of my paper with Akerlof and Rayo on this. And we use a relatively new game theoretic tool, not one that we invented, but that we, I guess, thought would be useful. And we've used in a couple of papers now, Robbie and I have. And it's based on this idea of impulses. So it's based on the idea that I might have an impulse to do what I did last period or in a recent period. So if I last bought a book on Amazon, then I might say if I'm going to buy a book, my impulse is to buy a book on Amazon, but I'm fully rational. I think about how many other people are on the platform. I think about the price. I think about all the time it's going to take and so on. But I have this kind of impulse. It's not a default. It's, in the language of economics, it's my level zero thought about what to do. And then I'm fully rational. I best respond to what everyone else is doing. And so I think about what Al's thought process is, and then I take that into account, and I take into account that he's going to think about Benk's thought process and so on. And once we sort of take this to its logical conclusion, that leads to an equilibrium. Now, this equilibrium has the features that all those three key features of these markets have. Okay, that there's this asymmetry where it's hard to go from being out to being in, but it's relatively easy to go the other way around. And this relates to a body of work I've worked on in recent years with Robbie Akerlof, including this Movers and Shakers paper from a couple of years ago in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and a new paper on assembling capital for projects that's just coming out in another journal later this year. So what this leads to is a number of implications, and I'm just going to go through really one or two of them in the interest of time. One of them that comes from this asymmetry of in and out is that in firms find it more in their interest to innovate. So you could think of firms being able to pay some private cost to invest in making their product more attractive. And that's privately costly, but if they do so, consumers are going to value it more. And then you can ask the question in the context of this model, is it the out firm or the in firm that's going to have a bigger incentive to do this? And it's the in firm. Because if the out firm does it, all that's going to happen rationally in an equilibrium is the in firm's going to adjust their price downwards to keep everything the same for consumers. And so the out firm really doesn't benefit by all that much from innovating. The in firm, however, is going to benefit a great deal because they serve such a large share of the market. And therefore, if they can make consumers better off, they can adjust their price accordingly, so they benefit a lot. So really, one of the insights is that in these sorts of markets, you're competing not for a marginal consumer, but you're competing for the market. And that has implications for who's going to innovate and how we think about things like antitrust policy. And that's a topic it's a big issue of debate in, say, the Democratic primaries that are coming up for the election of the United States president in 2020, and there's a lot of talk about what should happen with that, and we think this brings a perspective that says that actually the old way of thinking about dominant firms in terms of antitrust may not be appropriate for these kinds of markets, and it has implications even for things like thinking about discounted cash flow valuation. So I think overall new technologies are exciting and important for a whole range of reasons that Mike Spence articulated so well in his remarks at the start. One implication that they have that I'm very interested in is what they're going to do to the boundaries of the firm and to this age-old Coasian question that Ronald Coase raised about what happens in firms and what happens in markets. Thank you very much.